I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 7 English lesson on adjectives. And before we start with our lesson on adjectives, right, we are on the already we're on the page of A plus students, but today, just a heads up that we are not going to do our tutorial lesson on A plus students.ca, right? All right, so we're doing our grade 7 English lesson on adjectives, right? So we basically going to find out what adjectives are, right? And we will find out that we have adjectives that will tell us how many, as well as adjectives that will tell us what kind, right? So we have adjectives that tells us what kind and adjectives that tells us how many. And we're going to basically find out today about that. All right, so I'm not sure if you can see on the screen. So I'm not sure if you can see on the screen. Um, but we are doing our chapter is adjectives. We said our subject is English language arts, grade 7, right? And then today we're just going to focus on the lessons of adjectives that tells us what kind, as well as it tells us how many, right? Okay, so adjectives are words that tell us more about the noun, right? And it is words that we can also say that modifies the noun. Another word is also where we can say that adjectives, it describes the noun, right? And nouns are names, it names people, it names places, animals, things, right? Those are nouns, right? It names people, places, animals, things, right? So an adjective, it basically it tells us more about the noun. So it can either tell us more about the person, can either tell us more about the place, the animal, or that specific thing. It describes that thing or it modifies that person, place, the animal, or that thing, right? And then we have some adjectives, right? Adjectives that also tells us what kind, and we have adjectives that tells us how many, right? Adjectives that tells us what kind, it can basically be things like describing a dress, right? So if you describe a dress, then for example, you will tell us what kind of dress it is, right? You will describe the dress either as in the color, right? Let me just write that. So let's say, for example, if we say what kind, and if we say what kind, then it means that you can maybe describe a dress as in you can maybe describe a dress as in the color, right? You can even describe something as in height, for example, right? You can describe something as in length, even, right? If it's something is long, if something is short, right? That is also how you can basically describe something, right? That is but just a few examples of adjectives that tells us what kind, right, of something it is. Um, Size, even, right? We can even describe something in size. For example, if it's big or if it is small, right? That is basically adjectives that tells us what kind. So like I say, adjectives that tells us what kind can either describe something in size, can describe something in color, in length, or even in height, right? And then we have adjectives that tells us how many, right? So adjectives that tells us how many, and these are words that can either say, for example, it can give us a number. Like maybe it will tell you two books, three books, right? So it will give you the number of books, for example, or the number of something. I'm gonna say number of something, right? Sometimes it doesn't have to give you an actual number like one book, two book, five books, seven books, right? But it can also be something that can maybe give you words like several, right? Many, little, few, right? Those are also words that tells us how many, because it doesn't necessarily have to be where we say I have 10 friends or two dresses, right? Or my three books, right? You can also say several books, right? Many books, right? A lot of books, right? Those are words that basically describe it, as into it describes us, it describe basically the adjective, or describes the noun, sorry, as in telling us how many, right? And we said with adjectives, it tells us what kind, and adjectives, they tell us how many, right? All right. So now if we look at a few examples of adjectives. So once again, we said adjectives are words that tell us more about a noun, right? Or that tell us more about nouns, or it modifies a noun, or tells us more about the noun, modifies a noun, or describes a noun, right? That is adjectives. And we said some of our adjectives, they either tell us what kind, or some of the adjectives, they tell us how many, right? All right, so if we look at a few examples of adjectives, right? Remember, adjectives, we said it can be words that can either be described in a specific color, in a specific, it can be in length, it can be in size, it can be in height, right? It can either be, if we talk about the like how many, then it can either be in a number where we either say 1 to 10, depending, or if we can use words like several and so on, right? So if we look at an example of a sentence, and then we're going to identify the adjective within that sentence, right? It says, Rima is a beautiful girl. So Rima is a beautiful girl. So if we look at that sentence, right? Rima is a beautiful girl. Does that tell us what kind of girl it is, or does it tell us how many girls it is? Right? So we need to basically answer the question and ask ourselves, does it basically ask us or tell us what kind of girl Rima is, or does it tell us how many girls Rima is? All right. So basically, if we look at this example, right, it says Rima is a beautiful girl. So which means that it basically tells us what kind of girl Rima is, right? So it tells us what kind of girl Rima is. So it basically tells us she's a beautiful girl. So which means that our adjective is beautiful, right? So our adjective that we have identified that tells us what kind of girl Rima is, we can say that she's a beautiful girl, right? Then it says the girl is poor. So the girl is poor, right? So basically, we need to identify a word within that sentence that describes the girl, right? It says the girl is poor. And if we were to identify, right, that tells us what kind of girl it is, right? It tells us more about the girl because the girl is the noun, right? And then we can say that poor describes the girl, right? So poor describes the girl. And that tells us what kind of girl is it, right? So what kind of girl is it? We can say she's a poor girl, right? Or we can say she's a rich girl, right? Depending. I have two books. Does this basically tell us what kind of books it is, or does it tell us how many books it is? So I have two books. So I have two books. We need to ask ourselves, does it ask us what kind of books, or does it ask us how many books? So what kind of books or how many books? All right. So basically, this sentence it says, I have two books, right? And the word two tells us how many books this person has, right? So I have two books. So basically, our adjective is two, right? So it tells us how many books this person has. So I have two books. So how many books do you have? Two books. So this sentence specifically tells us how many and it doesn't tell us what kind. The white cow is big. So the white cow is big. We need to describe this cow, right? And if we describe the cow and basically it tells us what kind of cow, we can either say it is a white cow or we can even basically describe it as it being big, right? So which means that we have two words. So which is white and we have big. All right. So we basically that basically tells us what kind. White tells us what kind of cow it is. It is a white cow. Also, big tells us what kind it is because it tells us it is a big cow, right? So the two words, right, which is white, which describes the cow in color, and big also describes the cow in size, right? So it says that the white cow is big. So we have identified white and we have identified the word big that describes the cow. And it basically tells us what kind of cow is it. It is a white and it is a big cow. All right. If we look at this one that we skipped, number four says, the tree is tall. The tree is tall. If we were to describe that tree, right, and basically tells us does it basically tells us what kind of tree, right? So we can then say that this tree is tall because it basically tells us what kind. It does not tell us how many. It doesn't tell us the 5 trees are tall, right? Or several trees are tall, or a lot of trees are tall. They're not telling us that, they're just telling us that the tree is tall, which means that our adjective is tall, right? So, what kind of tree? It is a tall tree, right? So, it's like asking what kind of tree? It is a tall tree. Then we have another sentence that says, our house is big. So, our house is big. We need to describe the house. So, what kind of house is it, right? Because it's basically telling us what kind and it's not telling us how many. Because if we were to say how many, then we could have said that our house is big with 6 rooms, right? So which means that then we would have had 2 adjectives, one telling us how big the house is and the other one telling us how many rooms there are. So our house is big. And if we were to identify the adjective, then we were to identify the adjective as being big, and it basically tells us what kind of house, right? It is a big house. So big being our adjective that basically tells us what kind. Then we have another one that says the dishonest boy lost everything. So the dishonest boy lost everything. How are we going to describe that boy? Are we going to describe him in what kind of boy? Or are we going to describe him and to say how many boys? So the dishonest boy lost everything. All right. And if we identify what kind of boy it is, then we can say it is the dishonest boy. Because dishonest, it describes the boy. So dishonest, it describes the boy. So now it's like asking you, like, what kind of boy is it? And then you can say, like, no, this is the dishonest boy, right? It is the naughty boy. He is a good boy, right? The shy boy. Those are all words, for example, that tells us what kind of boy it is, right? And in this case, they're saying the dishonest boy lost everything. So if we were to say what kind of boy it is, we would say it is a dishonest boy. All right. Then it says, we ate delicious food. We ate delicious food. And if we look at that specific sentence, right, it says we ate delicious food. Does that tell us what kind of food we are eating, or does it tell us how many foods we are eating? We ate delicious food. Does it tell us what kind of food we ate, or does it tell us how many food we ate? All right. So if we look at the word delicious, right, that basically describes the food, right? So delicious describes the food. So we can then say that we ate delicious food. Delicious being the food, or tells us what kind of food it is. And it basically tells us that the food is delicious. The food is nice, the food is yummy, right? Those are all words that we can even use to describe the word food. Then Anna was a brave girl. So Anna was a brave girl. So what kind of girl was Anna? So what kind of girl was Anna? It says Anna was a brave girl. All right, so now it says Anna was a brave girl. And if we were to ask what kind of girl Anna is, right? Because remember that is, we need to basically ask ourselves what kind, or we ask ourselves how many, right? Then we can basically say what kind, or we ask ourselves what kind of girl is Anna, right? So it basically just tells us what kind. It does not tell us how many. It doesn't tell us how many girls there are, right? It just says that Anna was a brave girl. So which means that our adjective, which tells us more about the girl, right, which tells us more about Anna, for example, is brave. And then lastly, we have Sita wore a pretty dress. Sita wore a pretty dress. All right, so it says Sita wore a pretty dress. And if we look at that sentence, right, Sita wore a pretty dress. So now we need to ask ourselves, is it what kind, do the question ask us what kind of dress Sita wore? Or how many dresses Sita wore? All right, so Sita wore a pretty dress. And if we were to identify what kind of dress Sita wore, then we can say she wore a pretty dress, which means that pretty is our adjective. Pretty. Right? And if we look at the list, right, 1 to 10, most of these words or the adjectives, it tells us what kind. All right. So basically, we said that these words that we have identified as adjectives, it either tells us what kind and the noun, right? Or it tells us how many, sorry, and the noun, right? Because we see that some words or some adjectives, they either tell us what kind, or we have others that tells us how many. And we said words that adjectives or sentences that tells us how many, right, can be words such as, it can either be the specific number, right, 1, 2, 5, 10, 100, or so on, right, or it can be words that are, for example, we can use words like several, a lot, much, few, less, right? Those are also words that tells us how many. And words that tells us what kind, there's always more words that tells us what kind. And that can be words like beautiful, it can be words like poor or rich, tall or short, big or small, right? White or any other color that we can think of, white or black, right? Big, dishonest, delicious, describing how the food tastes, delicious, yummy, scrumptious, right? Those are words that we can use to describe, let's say, the food. And then we have a brave girl, courageous girl, right? So these are words, the kind girl. Those are words that basically tells us what kind. And lastly, we have a pretty dress, a beautiful dress, a lovely dress, the red dress, right? Those are words that tells us what kind. And then we have one word in there that gives us only the word that tells us how many, and that is two, right? Where it says I have two books. So two tells us how many books you have. All right. So once again, we have adjectives, right? And adjectives are words that tells us more about the noun. Or we can say adjectives are words that modify the noun, right? Or we can even say that adjectives, they describes the noun. And we say that nouns are words or names of people, places, animals, and things, right? All right. So if we look at these words, right, we see that these words either tells us what kind of adjective it is or it tells us how many adjectives they are, right? And once again, we have identified the adjectives within our sentences, which is beautiful, poor, too, tall, big, white, big, dishonest, delicious, brave, and pretty. And remember, you can basically describe an adjective however you want, as long as it tells us what kind or it tells us how many, right? All right. All right. If we even look at a few more words that tells us more about adjectives. Remember we said words that tells us how many can be that tells us what kind can be words that can either be described as in weight, it can be described as in height, it can be described as in size, temperature, can either be described in age even, right? Shape, color, or even material, right? And if we basically find out more about how we describe it, right, then maybe we can say that if we describe something in size, we can say it is big, it is small, it is large, long, narrow, or so on, right? That is not if we describe something in size. Then we have something in weight, right? You can either say it is the heavy container or the light feather, right? Those are words that are being described described and basically tells us what kind, right? And then we have adjectives, right? Like your normal adjectives. Let me write it down. And we can even say it can basically tell a mood also, right? If you are maybe excited or you are happy, right? Or you are clever or smart is also another word. Smart or clever, right? Or you are interesting. These are even words that tells us based on an emotion, right? Can tell us how we are feeling, right? I am excited, I am happy, I am clever, I am smart, or I am interesting. right? Then we have adjectives that are basically described in temperature, right? And if we were to describe temperature, we can say it is cold, it is hot, right? We can even say it is humid. So these are how we even describe either our nouns. It can either be describe a person, place, animal, or a thing, right? We can even say it is warm. And that is basically when we describe the temperature, right? All right. So if we, for example, find our adjectives and describe it as in the temperature, then we can use words like cold, we can use words like hot, humid, warm, right? Those are just a few words that you can use for temperature. And then we have even words that we can use or describe in color, right? And color can basically be any color. It can be white. Let me use a different color. So it can either be white. This is now it being described in color. Can be black, red, green, blue, right? That is but a few basic words that we can use that is basically described either as in color, can be described either as in temperature, right? Or it can even be described as in size. And all of these words, they tell us what kind of adjective it is. All right. So basically, adjectives, it is a word that tells us more about the noun. It's a word that describes the noun. And it's also a word that we can say that modifies the noun, right? And we said, firstly, before we go on to what an adjective is, right? Or we go deeper into what an adjective is, we said adjectives, they basically tell us what kind, and we have adjectives that tells us how many, right? So basically, adjective is a word that basically gives us more information about something, right? Whether you are telling me about the girl, so basically, it will give us more information about that girl, right? So it basically generally just describes the noun, and we said noun is a person, a place, a thing, or even an animal that can be a noun. All right. So basically, if we look at the words that are in color, these are, for example, words that describe um um that describes the nouns, right? And we said nouns can be people, can be places, can be things, right? Or even animals. Those are nouns. So which means that these words they can basically, let's say, describe our noun, right? Describe our person, right? Or thing, for example, for that matter. And we can either describe it as it in the mood, right, which is excited, happy, clever, smart, interesting, right? That basically tells us what kind of people they are, right? They are excited, they are happy, clever, smart, and they are interesting. Then we have we said we have adjectives that basically you have to they basically tell you what kind of adjective it is based on temperature. So it can either be cold, or it can be hot, or it can be humid, or it can just be warm, right? They basically tell us what kind of noun it is, right? What kind of adjective that is, right? And what it basically describes, what it modifies, or what it tells us about. And then we have adjectives that in different color, right? We have white, black, red, blue, green, right? So we can basically describe an adjective, describe a noun. Okay, an adjective is a noun. Describing is an adjective. So we can basically describe the noun based on temperature, on color, on mood and excitement, on size, right? Material, right? We can basically describe our noun like that, right? And once again, our nouns are it's names of people, it is names of places, animals, or even things, right? That is a noun, or those are nouns. So nouns are names of people, places, animals, or things. Or it is a person, a place, an animal, or a thing, right? All right. I'm not even sure if you can see on the board. All right. Okay, so even with our adjectives, right? So if we have adjectives that describe our nouns or tells us more about our nouns, right? Then we can even have adjectives that basically with its meaning. Remember, with an adjective, right? You need to know the meaning of that adjective in order for it to be described, right? You can't just describe something and then you don't even know what you are describing or what the description is, right? So then maybe if, let's say, for example, we say that the girl is brave. So we say that the girl is brave, or Anna was a brave girl. And if we look at the meaning of that word brave, we look at the meaning of the word brave. Brave meaning is when you are either bold, it can either also mean when you are courageous, when you are daring, which means that you are willing to try like things, right? New things. You are adventurous, you are not scared, and you basically endure something without showing some form of fear, right? That is when you are brave. Brave can also be when you stand up towards bullying, right? Because remember, sometimes bullying, they think that they are bigger than you. So now they think that they can look down on you. But brave is when you basically stand up towards the bullying without fear, right? If we look at, for example, if we were to say that the prince or the charming prince was looking, oh, the charming prince went to the ball, right? Let's say the charming prince went to the ball. This is just an example, right? We have the charming prince went to the ball. So if we have a word, the sentence that says the charming prince went to the ball, and if were to identify our adjective, we would identify it being charming, right? It tells us basically what kind of prince it is, right? And if we look at the meaning of the word charming, charming basically means, let me think. It can mean like where you are either attractive, you are good looking, right? It can be you are very pleasant, right? In basically appearance. So pleasant in appearance. And even a word that we can say enchanting, right? You look good, beautiful, handsome, right? And if we look at another sentence, right? We can say the kids walked over the clean floor. So the kids walked over the clean floor. And our adjective over here is clean because it tells us what kind of floor that these kids walked over, right? And the word clean, it can either be tidy, fresh, pure, right? It is spotless, right? And it is the opposite of dirty, right? And these are basically everything that we had described, everything that we spoke about are adjectives, right? And we said adjectives are words that tells us more about the noun, right? It can be words that modifies the noun, or it can be words that describes the noun, right? Those are adjectives, right? We said some adjectives that tell us what kind. And then we have adjectives that also tells us how many, right? Some of the words or some words that we can say that are what kind can be words like beautiful, poor, rich, can be ugly, can be tall, short, right? Big or small, red or black, right? Um honest, dishonest, right? Delicious, yummy, those are words that basically tells us what kind. And then we have words that tells us how many of the nouns that is being described. It can either be in a number form, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up until 10, up until 20, 100 or more, right? That is how you can describe something. Or you can say use words like several, many, less, more, right? Those are words that either tells us what kind or it's words that tells us how many, right? All right, so this is now the end of our lesson on adjectives. Thank you very much for joining the class. And I really hope that you are going to, or that you had an amazing time. You should enjoy your evening further. Goodbye.